In recent years, Hollywood adaptations are anything but an adaptation. In many cases, we see shows, movies that are basically just skin suits of the IP, and it is a totally different story than what they said they were actually adapting. The Rings of Power, The Wheel of Time come to mind. And Brandon Sanderson has affirmed that this is because scriptwriters are pitching IP projects to use the IP as a skin suit for their own original story that Hollywood studios would not take a look at if it was not being inserted into the IP. Roll this up over at fandompulse.com. You can find the link in the description below. So Sanderson posted this to the Lord of the Rings memes subreddit back in October, but I caught wind of it last week. And he shared an anecdote about how one of his lesser-known stories, Emperor's Soul, was optioned for a Hollywood project. After explaining how the writer for the project was the one who pitched it and eventually convinced the studio to option the rights, Sanderson revealed that when he eventually got his hands on the script for the adaptation, it was nothing like his novel and described it as, quote, one of the most bizarre experiences of my life. He continued saying the character names were largely the same, though nothing that happened to them was remotely similar to the story. Emperor's Soul is a small-scale character drama that takes place largely in one room, with discussions of the nature of art between two characters who approach the idea differently. The screenplay detailed an expansive fantasy epic with a new love interest for the main character, a pirate captain. They globetrotted, they fought monsters, they explored a world largely unrelated to mine, save for a few words here and there. Sanderson then explained why the script was so different from his novel, which it was supposed to be adapting. And he said Hollywood doesn't buy spec scripts, original ideas, from screenwriters very often, and they never buy spec scripts that are epic fantasy. Those are too big, too expensive, and too daunting. They are the sorts of stories where the producers and executives need the proof of an established book series to justify the production. So this writer never had a chance to tell his own epic fantasy story, though he wanted to. Instead, he found a popularish story that nobody had snatched up and used it as a means to tell the story he'd always wanted to tell because he'd never otherwise have a chance of getting it made. So I do think we've seen some evidence to the contrary to what Sanderson is saying. I think what he is saying is, I think, true in a general sense, but obviously we did see some original IP was in that kind of epic fantasy sci-fi setting. You can look at something like Rebel Moon that Zack Snyder made with Netflix. Obviously, they're banking off of his name, and that might be the security that the producers had, but they clearly did indeed allow him to kind of try to create his own epic fantasy sci-fi universe. I don't think it worked out very well at all. Most people had tuned out after the first movie. Anyways, Sanderson then concluded that this was not a one-time deal, but is a major problem within Hollywood and is one of the many issues affecting the so-called adaptations that are currently being made. He said, I'm convinced this is part of the issue with some of these adaptations. Screenwriters and directives are creative and want to tell their own stories, but it's almost impossible to get those made in things like the fantasy genre unless you're a huge established name like James Cameron. I'm not saying they all do this deliberately, and I guess obviously that explains the Snyder thing, right? I'm not saying they all do this deliberately, as that screenwriter did for my work, but I think it's an unconscious influence. They want to tell their stories, and this is the allowed method. So when given the chance at freedom, they go off the rails, and the execs don't know the genre or property well enough to understand why this can lead to disaster. I didn't include it in this article, but this kind of pops in my mind here when we go back to the guy who's writing the Harry Potter show for the upcoming HBO Max adaptation. That guy literally said that if they did a direct adaptation, it would make bank and would do really well, but that was not something he was actually interested in. He wanted to put his own spin on it. So while Sanderson is trying to give them the caveat that they're just doing this unconsciously, I think most of them are doing it consciously. They know exactly what they're doing. They know what the source material is, and they are actively not wanting to do that source material. They don't want to actually do a direct adaptation. They want to put their own spin on it. They want to do their own thing. So I don't think it's actually happening for the most part unconsciously. I think it is done as a conscious decision. And again, Sanderson isn't the only one to point this out. In March 2023, the Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves directors John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein admitted to this practice while promoting their film. The duo were asked by Variety, to be able to do the kind of storytelling at the level you want to do it, do you feel you have to find a way into a franchise versus writing an original story? And Goldstein replied, using using existing IP certainly greases the wheels. Any meeting we have with a studio head starts with, here's 4 things we own. Got any interest? To some extent, I think we use intellectual property as a bit of a costume to get ourselves in the door. So obviously he uses costume instead of skin suit, basically the same thing, right? We're still going to make the movie that we want to make. It just makes it all a bit easier to get it going if it has something that people are very familiar with. So they are admitting that they use IP as a skin suit in order to tell the story they want to tell instead of doing an actual adaptation, which is what the fans want. The fans want actual adaptations, not whatever story these people pitching these projects want to tell, which are not adaptations, which they admit. In fact, we also had the Lord of the Rings of Power showrunners. They similarly noted they were planning to write the book that Tolkien never wrote, despite the fact the show is set in the Second Age and Tolkien wrote the Silmarillion, a whole book that his son Christopher published that details the major events of the First Age and the Second Age. Nevertheless, Rings of Power showrunner Patrick McKay told Vanity Fair that the driving question for their show was, can we come up with the novel Tolkien never wrote and do it as the mega event series that could only happen now? So you can see there, they literally wanted to do their own thing, come up with a novel that Tolkien never wrote, despite the fact that he did indeed write the Silmarillion, and it was published posthumously by Tolkien's son, Christopher. And he talks about this in all of his letters that he had been working on the Silmarillion for years before he even published The Lord of the Rings. So this is what is going on. One of the major problems with Hollywood is that these screenwriters, these scriptwriters, put their ego over the actual project and the fan desires for an actual adaptation. They can't put their ego aside. They can't show that humility and do a proper adaptation. And that is why we've seen these adaptations fail over and over and over again, despite clear evidence showing that there is demand for that adaptation. We see this, I think, with Rings of Power. It did like 1.8 billion minutes watched when it first came out, but then it lost like 63% of its audience or something like that by the end of the first season. Like they stopped watching. So I think we see this time and time again, that there is this demand for these adaptations, but what happens is you have people like Patrick McKay come in, try to do their own thing, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We saw this with Wheel of Time. Rafe Judkins, again, I think it did over like 1 billion minutes watched when it premiered back in like 2022 or whatever it did, and they canceled it after the third season when we saw that it was like down to like 1.9 million viewers in the 18 to 49 demo, was like tied for 98th on the top 100 TV show charts that Nielsen put out just a couple of weeks ago, and people clearly were not interested in what he was making, which was not really an adaptation of the Wheel of Time whatsoever. And again, this happens over and over and over and over again, and it bleeds viewers because they are not getting what they are promised with the adaptation. So this is a major problem that Hollywood has, and I think it is largely driven by the ego of these scriptwriters that want to tell the story that Tolkien never wrote, etc. That is their motto, right? Aside from many of them also being infected with woke ideology and trying to push that onto these adaptations as well. But that is a discussion for another video. But let me know what you guys make of this. Let me know in the comments below. Remember to always be charitable, especially to each other, and to always, always speak the truth.
Why would you be afraid of the people? Why are you not afraid of God instead of man?